Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's good to have you here, Andrew. And for those who don't know Andrew Sherry, he's Professor of Materials and Structures at the University of Manchester, where he works less than 100 metres from where I worked on my own PhD. But that's not how we know each other. Before he started his academic career in 2004, Andrew worked in the UK civil nuclear industry, where he led science and innovation, skills and infrastructure development in industry and in national laboratories. He's been the chief scientist at the UK's National Nuclear Laboratory and the director of the Dalton Nuclear Institute at Manchester. But now, Professor Sherry's main research interests are in structural and fuel materials for nuclear power, structural integrity assessment, and data-centric engineering. But among his teaching interests is understanding the conditions for a successful safety culture, which is how we came to meet indirectly, but it's also why I wanted to speak with you, Andrew, today about safety and security in project delivery. So, Andrew, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Me too. This is a topic that really haven't covered nearly well enough on the channel, so I'm hoping we can learn a lot from you. It seems to me that it's pretty obvious why project managers need to focus on safety and security in the kinds of civil engineering projects where you started your career. There are many dangers on site, lots of valuable machinery, lots of tools, lots of materials, and I'm guessing in the nuclear industry, some pretty important intellectual property to look after as well. But why do you believe that every project manager needs to concern themselves with safety and security as part of their project management practice?
Well, I think there's a couple of answers to that, really. In my view, everybody should be concerned about safety and security. We can all get hurt ourselves. Our colleagues can be hurt. Our communities can be hurt and suffer. And our environment can be damaged and so on. And one of the things that I've learned is that it's really everybody's concern to not only protect ourselves, but our colleagues and our communities and our environment as well. But I think project managers have a particular role to play in that as well, for a couple of reasons, really. The first is, as a project manager, you are effectively operating as a leader or a manager within an organization, albeit associated with a particular project. Now, most of your time might be spent in an office, and of course there are health and safety issues around slips, trips and falls in the office, and we should all be aware of those. But equally, on the projects that are being managed, there are other people who may be in situations where there is a risk, a safety or a security risk. And I think the project manager should be aware of what those are and should help to manage and mitigate any safety or security risk that anybody involved in the project may come up against. Particularly because certainly a lot of the project managers that I know are really keen to demonstrate success in a project, and that is often measured by time or by cost or by quality. And those are all drivers for a successful project. But if somebody is being asked to do something and deliver a particular deliverable in a certain time scale, but they cannot do that safely, that becomes a concern. And one of the things a lot of industries say, and the industry I've been associated with most of my career, the nuclear industry, certainly would say, safety is our number one priority. And therefore, project managers may come up against this tension that relates to a successful project on the one hand and safety and security on the other hand. And we have to learn how to manage that tension and find our way through it. So simply to ignore safety and security is not an option for anybody, but project managers, I think, have a particular role to play in recognizing that and helping to manage it effectively.
Yeah. And I think from my own experience, one of the things that I'd add is, and I like that sense of, I guess, that duty of care element that you put in there, because that's something I always felt as a project manager. But the thing that strikes me is that projects can be quite stressful environments because the pressure ramps up, the time pressure, the pressure to get things out and right. That adds stress, and even if we set aside for the moment that stress itself is a health threat, but as we get stressed, we become less careful and we make more mistakes. So the whole thing can snowball. So I guess the follow-on question from that then is, if we've got to manage safety and security, why isn't it just part of the basic risk management process? Why don't we just say, well, there's a safety risk, there's a security risk, put it on our risk register and treat it just the same as every other risk that we spot?
Well, I think that's a very good approach to thinking about how do we manage safety risk. You know, we might have one line on a project program risk register around safety and one around security, but of course you have to think about what does that mean for that particular project, because the safety risk and the hazards will be specific to the work that's being done. So, you know, if it's construction, you know, there may be risks of falling, risks of heavy objects, risks of, you know, equipment failure and all of this. And really, this is where I think the workforce and the people who are actually at the sharp end are so important, because they will be seeing and understanding and have the experience to manage a lot of those risks. So involving that community in unpacking, so what are the risks we're going to face within this project? What are the consequences if that risk were to happen, and the probability of that, and therefore how do we mitigate that risk? That is almost a kind of community activity to think about. And one of the other aspects to this is that different people will see different risks differently. I mean, one person I know is very happy to take risks. If it happens, it happens, is the sort of attitude. Somebody else I know really doesn't like to take any risks and will almost get to the stage where they don't do anything. And you want to be somewhere in between that, where the community and particularly the managers and the leaders feel comfortable, because at the end of the day, somebody is responsible. And if there were to be an accident or a security breach or something like that, somebody has to be we call it the duty holder. The person who, if something goes wrong, they will be the ones in court giving evidence. And having clarity over who that person is and our role within that management framework is extremely important, because if the dot is on your forehead,
yes,
you start to look at things a bit differently, right?
Yeah, sharpens
ownership. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really nice. The whole thing for me about putting health and safety as risks on the risk register is to remember that safety, security, those sorts of things are not risks. They are whole categories of risk, and we need to break them out, as you say. And the tool that I quite like to use is fishbone analysis, the Ishikawa diagram, and say, well, look, okay, safety is a risk or a group of risks, but what are the different areas where things could go wrong? And then for each of those, how can that happen? And when you break it down to the granularity of what can happen and the implications, those are things you can manage. You can't manage, there's a safety risk. It's too big and amorphous to manage. And I guess it's my approach is always kind of scale your approach to anything, whether it's health and safety management, security management, to the nature of the project, adapt and tailor. And if you find there's an awful lot of safety risks or a lot of security risks, then you might pull it out and build a security management plan or a health and safety plan. If not, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines on your risk register is perfectly fit for purpose.
Well, absolutely. But the other thing that I'd add, and this is something that within the university context I've seen and challenge, is often research students may be doing similar sorts of experiments, and they say, would you send me the risk register you did for that? And they simply, the risk is they copy and paste it and sign it themselves and submit it. But the purpose of a risk register, I think, is to make you think, make you understand what you're going to do, what the hazards are and how you might manage and control those, either from your knowledge, from the equipment that you're going to use, or the process or the management procedure you may apply in doing that. And by thinking about it, you start to take ownership. So this idea of, oh, well, we've got a risk register because this is the same project that we did 5 years ago, and so we're just going to, that doesn't work for me. Somebody, or as I said before, a sort of community, including those at the sharp end, need to think about it themselves, because ownership is about thinking, understanding, and buying in to the approaches to mitigate. You're absolutely right. The fish, bone diagram is a good one. Bow tie diagrams. There's all sorts of tools that can be used to do that, aren't there?
Yeah, I'd go a little further. Having a great risk register that is perfectly tailored to the project and carefully thought about is great. But I remember visiting a project and asking the project management, what are you doing about risk? And he passed me the risk register and I looked at it and it was good. And I passed it back to him and I looked him in the eye and said, what are you doing about risk? And he looked at me like I was a fool, handed the risk register back. And I said, no, what are you doing about risk? And he had this risk register, but he didn't have a management procedure for frequently and regularly reviewing what risks were on the register that hadn't been inquired into, updated, and going to speak to people, making sure things were getting done, finding out the results of actions and whether more needed to be done. And when you're talking about health and safety, when you're talking about security, not doing the things that you put on your risk register is tantamount to negligence. And I always tell people, your responsibility as a professional, as a manager, a leader, whatever, is not to be right every time. It's not to spot every single risk and find the right approach to dealing with every single risk. It's to act with diligence. If you've thought it through carefully, you've engaged your team, and you've missed something, well, that will happen from time to time.
Well, I'd go on actually and build on that even more, because that will happen. And this is where reporting of risks and learning from experience is so crucial. We always used to, when I was working in the nuclear industry, we always used to think about a triangle, a sort of reporting triangle, where you would report near misses, you might report minor issues if there was a major issue, or, at the top of the list, you've got a big nuclear accident sort of thing. Well, clearly you don't want any of those at the top, but you want loads of reporting of near misses or something that I've seen that didn't lead to an accident, but actually I realized this could have happened, because a near miss is, often it's something that you're lucky it wasn't an accident. So having this reporting culture of near misses enables project managers to think and see things that they had missed before. And therefore the risk register becomes a live document that is updated with that learning from experience, and having that reporting culture, that regular review of those near misses and so on and so forth, and feeding that into the risk register keeps it live. And as you say, it's not a document that's on a shelf and that document's going to keep you safe.
Yeah.
It's what you do.
Yes, exactly. I like that idea of tracking the multitude of little near misses, because that's what gives you some sort of confidence that you're looking closely enough that you've got a chance of spotting the big things.
Yeah.
My experience is that the sooner we start to think about important things like safety and security, the better results we get. You're nodding, so I'm glad to see that you're agreeing with that. But where do we start? How do we start the kind of process of thinking about it so that we do get things right? Can you, from your experience, can you give us a basic framework that we can apply to adapt and build our own individual processes on?
Yes. So in my experience, the first step is to have as clear an idea of what you're trying to achieve in the project as you can do. I've seen projects where they've talked about, let's say, creating a laboratory for, a particular piece of work or whatever. But when that laboratory purpose, if you like, the why of that laboratory, and therefore given the why, how it's going to be developed and what equipment is going to be in there, if that is not clear, then it's sort of unbounded. And it's quite difficult to start thinking about, well, what are the hazards? What are the risks? What's the likelihood that they might occur, and what's the consequence, and so on and so forth. So the first step for me is always clarity of purpose and what's going to be achieved, whether that's building a building, as much detail as possible, really. The second step is then to have a sort of workshop type idea where you start thinking about what are the risks, what are the hazards that we're going to be dealing with, within this program. And it's a sort of brainstorming exercise where there is no wrong answer, no risk is too small to put on your post-it and stick it on the wall, or however you're going to do that.
But you need remote.
Or too remote. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly right. And actually, those risks, sometimes you can think of them in terms of, I know we're focusing on health and safety here, but there will be financial risks. There may be workforce risks, there may be environmental risks. All of these sorts of things need to be thought about, but including clearly health and safety, and in my world, security risks as well. And then I think it takes, one or two people or a small team to take each of those and start to categorize them under headings and start to put a bit of structure into those. And then I always think about, so what is the hazard? What is the initiating event that we're thinking about? What's the consequence should that occur? And what's the likelihood that it will occur? And so what you end up is with a sort of a consequence probability or likelihood diagram where you've got dots, and clearly you don't want something that's high consequence and high probability. You cannot, you have to mitigate those things in one way, shape or form. So you need to do something. That might be related to developing a process or a procedure. It might be related to some particular sort of equipment safety specification on equipment. It might be, we've got to have qualified people who've got experience in this area to do this piece of work. Whatever it is, you put a mitigation and then you reassess what's the risk following the mitigation. And of course, the idea is that all those risks that were at the top right-hand corner of the diagram move down to an area where, and there is always risk, right? You cannot eliminate risk, but you can bring it down to a level where your risk appetite is satisfied. So as an organization or as a team, as an individual, you are happy, you can live with that level of risk. It's a little bit like when you cross the road. Some people will cross the road away from a zebra crossing or something because they reckon they're comfortable with that risk. My experience has taught me I very rarely do that now because I become increasingly, as I get older, I get increasingly uncomfortable about, my risk appetite has reduced, not increased. But you've got to get to a point where people are comfortable to do what they're doing. And that is the sort of approach. And that's the basis of the risk register. And that is the basis of the live document that you can then update with learning from experience, from near misses and so on as the project proceeds. I think there's one other thing that's really important in this. It's a little bit like when you build a building, you don't build it to hand it over to the building operators. You build it for the lifetime of that project, of that building. Yes. Okay. You don't build it for day one. You build it for the day it's going to be decommissioned. Whole life. And in nuclear, we even think about building it not just for the lifetime of that reactor, but for how it's going to be decommissioned in the future as well. That whole life cycle. And that's why thinking about safety and security risks, it isn't just that project, it's what's going to follow beyond the life of that project as well. A whole lifetime view on risk is important. And that's why I often think in terms of three approaches to mitigating risk. Actually, there's four, which I'll come to the fourth. But the three areas I often think about is one is people. So who is going to be doing the work? We have a phrase in the nuclear industry which talks about suitably qualified and experienced people. The acronym is SQEP. We love acronyms in the nuclear industry. So is it a SQEP workforce? Am I asking and in universities, that's really key because I've got young students who are doing advanced research. So how do I make sure they've got the understanding and the experience to do that? So that's the first and perhaps the most important area. The second area is what equipment and what facilities am I going to be using to do the activity? Is that equipment and those facilities, are they safe? Have they been checked? Are they old and aging themselves? Do I need to think about new equipment? What's the safety standards I'm trying to work on? And so on and so forth. So the equipment and facilities, or plant, if you want another P, you have people, plant, is the second thing. And the third area to use a P is process and procedure. In other words, have I written down how we're going to do what we're going to do? Have I based that on, experience of similar things? And am I confident that that will work? And what's my flexibility for updating that should we, find the need to do so? Those three areas, people, plant, and process, I think it is quite a nice structure to think about. How am I going to mitigate this risk or another risk? And it's a balance between all three. The fourth area that perhaps we'll come on and talk about a little bit later is culture, because safety culture is about how you do things, not what you're going to do. You can tell someone to build a wall and they might come in the weekend and do it themselves on their own, or they might come in with a team and do it on a Monday morning.
Yeah.
You've hopefully at the end of the day, you've got a wall built, to the right standard and height and dimensions and all the rest of it. But they've done it in two very different ways. One may be safer than the other. Yeah. So thinking about the culture, the how are we going to do this?
Yeah.
Actually, for me, that is the most important mitigation. And thinking about our safety culture.
With culture, you can do it the same way. You can answer the how the same way, but by doing it with a different attitude, going in with a different attitude can change the how subtly enough that perhaps a non-expert observer wouldn't see any difference. But just those little things about making sure that the PPE fits, the protective gear fits properly, and the equipment is under the right maintenance regime and has been visually inspect the equipment for you. So I think culture, it almost buried the lead there. But then you came around and said that is the most important thing. Of the three things, the fourth is the most important.
Yeah. Actually, just going back to something you said earlier about mental health, in terms of safety and so on. I was running a session yesterday around safety culture, and we got people to tell their own safety stories, because we've all got them, haven't we? We've all, seen something or so we've all got something to talk about. And one of the women in the meeting talked about an accident that happened, but the reason it happened was somebody's mental health. They just weren't in the mental space to do what they were being asked to do, but they were under pressure to do it. And so they did it, and there was an accident. And so one of the things that she's introduced is this idea of how are you feeling today?
Yeah.
And, there's various sort of emojis or whatever ways that is non-threatening to the team to talk about how they're feeling today. And if somebody, is feeling particularly down, maybe something's happened in their personal life or whatever, they can think, do you feel up to doing what you're being asked to do today?
Yes.
It's not using it as an excuse for not doing work, but it's recognizing that our mental health, and it's creating the culture where it's safe to have those conversations.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? People have to feel that if they say, I am not up to doing this piece of work safely, that they're not going to be judged for that. It's not going to be held over them as, this isn't a person we want in the team. It's actually something to celebrate, that they're smart enough to recognize that they're not ready to do that safely, and then the team can plan around it. I think it's really valuable idea. Of course, this isn't a perfect world. And despite all these preparations, we can have the strongest, most fit for purpose safety culture with everyone genuinely living that culture. But still serious things can go wrong. And a lot of my audience probably, I hope, have never experienced that, possibly because of the types of projects they do or have done, possibly because where they are in their career. But I'm guessing from your research, you've come across incidents that you've examined and understood. So, I mean, we can't be specific unless you choose to pull out an example. But for a project manager who is suddenly faced with a serious issue, an incident that is of real substance, what general advice would you give? How far can you take this in the generality?
Well, the way I think about this, and I can use an example, which I'll paint a picture in a minute, but the short answer is you need to think tactically first and strategically second.
Okay.
And breaking down actions into what is our tactical response to this incident? how are we going to fix it quickly so that we can get on and do what we need to do is first, there has to be a reaction and there has to be a sorting things out. And that might be as much, if somebody's been injured, it's getting them to hospital, it's informing their family, it's looking after the people. It may be something to do with, well, we need to shut down this facility, or we need to, if something's unsafe, make it safe, and so on. So there are a number of kind of tactical actions that need to be thought about in the hours, the days, following such an incident. But then there also has to be a strategic action plan, which is how are we going to make sure this never happens again? And this is then putting in those longer term structures and processes in place that will keep people safe as we progress through this project. That often takes longer to think about and implement, but is just as important. In fact, for the long term, it's most important, because you can live with a quick fix for a short time, but not long. So let me give you an example. And this is the one time I shut down a facility in my career. And I walked into a laboratory. I won't say where in the world it was, but it was a laboratory doing some materials work. And it was quite an old laboratory. The storage cabinets were a sort of mixed generation, and the equipment was sort of adequate or antique, which I wasn't saying it was unsafe, but there was water all over the floor. In fact, the floor wasn't just wet, there were puddles. And as I was about to ask, why is this leak not being fixed? Somebody splashed through the water and plugged in an electric kettle to heat some water for an experiment. And I could not believe my eyes. So I said, why is this leak not being fixed? And the community said, well, we've raised this with management time and again, but it never gets, it sort of gets a temporary fix, but it's never fixed for long term. It's like a tactical response, no strategic, to use my language before. Yeah. And we've got work to deliver. We've got deliverables, we've got customers paying for work, and we've got to deliver the work. Yeah. So I said, what are the implications of shutting the lab down now, today? And they thought about it. I said, well, you're not doing work in this lab. This is unsafe. I know friends who've slipped on wet floors and had to give up their work because of the injuries they sustained. I was not, So we shut the lab. Within 24 hours, the leak had been fixed and the floor was dry. So there's the tactical response. It was fixed, but within a year, they'd worked with the management of the organization to develop a new laboratory. And within a year, they were in their new laboratory. There was the strategic response. Yes. So you can see that wasn't an accident I'd responded to. It was a near miss, but it was that significant that action had to be taken. And, there's lots of lessons in that story to me that, the workforce want to do the right thing and they will raise concerns, but come back to project managers, I need that deliverable by this date because I've got a customer meeting under pressure. And despite the fact they've raised safety concerns, nothing's happened. And so they're reporting things. The management isn't listening. They're not confident that the management will act on their reporting. Therefore, they start to disengage from safety. They don't feel valued. They're scared that if they stop work, they will be blamed for a financial hit on the company. So maybe it's a blame culture, not a just. So there's all these sorts of factors
it's
that
a kind
project
of group
manager,
thing, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's groupthink. And therefore you start not noticing the water on the floor. It's like when you move into a new house and you think, wow, that's bright wallpaper, but after 6 months you've got used to it because you don't even see it. And that's the state they were in. But the reason I tell you that story is because that's a tactical response, shut the lab, fix the problem. Yeah. But that wasn't the whole fix. The whole fix required long-term thinking, a business case for a new laboratory, new equipment and everything like that. But at the end of the day, it was a good business decision that got them to a much better place.
Yeah. But it seems to me that your tactical response actually has two components. The first one is what can we do to make sure that whatever situation we have at this moment, it cannot get worse. In your case, if we shut the lab, no one's going to have an accident. And then the second part of the tactical thing is how can we get going as quickly as possible in a way that's safe, so that we've got time to work on the strategic response, which is then about how can we build a new, in this case, a new lab, but a new process, a new way of working that does not expose us to the risks that we've identified.
That's exactly right. Yeah, exactly right.
This has been excellent, Andrew. But is there anything that we've skirted around, but you feel that I didn't ask you the question, so you weren't able to give a useful piece of advice? Any tips that I haven't given you a chance to give?
Well, there's one little tip which, again, comes from my industry, but I find it really helpful, and it's an acronym. The acronym is STAR, STAR, and teams use this before they do a piece of work, during the piece of work, and at the end of the piece of work. And STAR stands for stop, think, act, review.
Yeah.
So before, a wall is built or a bridge is designed or whatever the project is, in those little activities and those team meetings, think, right, stop, what are we doing today?
Yeah.
Think, what are the hazards we might come across and how are we mitigating them? Mm-hmm. With that awareness, acting, doing the piece of work, and at the end of it, looking back and saying, well, how did that go? Did we anticipate everything? What have we learned from it? And what could we build into the next activity? So just that little start, and it doesn't take a long time within a team meeting or so. At the beginning of the day, stop, think, act, review. And the project manager is part of that.
Yeah, I love a good little mnemonic as a kind of thinking model. I have a very similar one, actually, which is SCOPE. Stop, clarify the situation, develop your options, proceed, and evaluate. So it's almost the same. But STAR's got the commendable benefit of being simpler. So I like that.
There you go.
So, Andrew, how can people find out a bit more about your work, perhaps engage with you online?
Well, the easiest way is through LinkedIn. Yep. Look up Andrew Sherry at the University of Manchester. There's only one of me.
Yeah, I'll put a link.
Put a link. And my email address is andrew.sherry@manchester.ac.uk. So that's not difficult. That's the best way. One of those two routes is fine.
Perfect. Well, we'll put links in the description to that. Andrew, I've learned a lot, and I'm sure anyone listening and watching has learned a lot too. So thank you very much for your time.
That's my pleasure. It's really good to chat, Mike. All the best.
Please do give us a thumbs up if you like this video. I'll be creating loads more great project management content, so please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of it. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.